Welcome to the Radically Christian Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Wes McAdams. Here we have one goal: learn to love like Jesus. On today's episode, I'm visiting and studying with my good friend Jeff Jenkins about his own journey with grief after losing his wife Laura, as well as how he is helping others navigate their journeys with grief. Even if you're not personally in a season of grief or sorrow right now, someone you know probably is. And unfortunately, you will be at some point in the future. That's why this conversation is necessary and important for all of us. But before we get to that conversation, I know that a good number of our listeners work in a ministry setting, and it's always encouraging to hear from you because I see in you a desire to grow in your relationship with the Lord and to better understand His Word. It's obvious that you have such a strong desire to serve other people. So I wanted to let you know of another resource from today's sponsor that can really help ignite a transformation in your work as a minister. Frieda Hardeman University offers a Master of Arts in Ministry degree that will provide you with a transformative journey in both theology and ministry. This program is tailored for aspiring or current ministers and offers the perfect blend of academic depth and practical application. With a flexible web conference format, you can balance your studies with your busy schedule without sacrificing the intimate setting of a classroom environment. The application process is completely free right now, and scholarships are available. So if you'd like to learn more, simply go to fhu.edu/radicallychristian. That's fhu.edu/radicallychristian. Okay, now my conversation with Jeff Jenkins, and as always, I hope this conversation helps all of us learn to love like Jesus. Jeff Jenkins, welcome to the podcast, brother.
Thank you, Wes. I'm delighted to be with you today.
I am so incredibly thankful that you've made time. You have an incredibly busy schedule, and I'm so thankful to have this opportunity to talk with you and to let other people see what a wonderful man of God you are. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you, the work that you do, and our friendship. I'm incredibly thankful for our friendship. So I'm sorry that it's taken so long to get you on the podcast.
Well, I'm sure it's not your fault. I appreciate you asked me about a year ago, I think, and we're finally here. And Wes, I want you to know how much I appreciate you. You're a great blessing to our brotherhood, to many, many people, but even more our friendship. It means the world to me. So I'm glad to see you anytime and talk with you anytime.
Likewise, brother. Likewise. Well, you have so many different aspects of your ministry and things that you do to encourage and teach and lead people. And we could talk about so many of those aspects of your ministry and the ways that you bless the kingdom. But one of the things that you've been ministering to people about recently is grief. And I think a good place to start would be your own journey with grief. And so if you don't mind, just share with us that journey that you've been on.
Sure, Wes. A couple of things maybe to introduce that. You know, this is not a part of my ministry that I ever dreamt would get to the point that it is. All of us who are in ministry have always tried to encourage people who are grieving, people who are hurting, and I've done that all my ministry life. I've done funerals, I don't know, probably thousands of them over the years, and have always had a heart for people like that, but I never thought in my own life that it would get to the point that it has. And then the other thing I want to say about this is that one of the things we say in our workshops that we do, and we'll talk more about that later, is that grief is a journey, and everybody who is on that journey is at a different point, and no two journeys are exactly the same. And so I don't in any way want my story to feel like to anybody that it is more important than anybody else's story, that it's more, for lack of a better way to say it, more sad than anybody else's story or more heartbreaking. I have one of my mentors when I was a young preacher in Alabama used to say, "Everybody has a story." That was one of his big quotes. That everybody, and he said we need to. Those of us who are preachers, we need to do a better job of letting people share their story and let them tell their story. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that that I've done that in theory throughout my life, but I've never, no time in my life have I been where I am now, where I seriously listened to somebody else's story, because I do have some kind of understanding of what people are dealing with. My wife, Laura, and I were married in 1981, and in 2004, we moved from Alabama to Oklahoma. We moved west of the Mississippi River for the first time. My family thought we were moving west of the ocean somewhere. That's what we thought about people west of the Mississippi River, and that everybody out here was different. And so we moved west, and after we had been in Oklahoma City about a month, my wife felt a spot on her breast, and she didn't know anything about that. She was only 24 years old at the time, and she was 34, and we went to the doctor. The doctor found out she had breast cancer, and we went through about a year's worth of chemotherapy and radiation. They did some surgery, and the doctor said we're 99.9% sure we got it all. During that year, our children were very young. My wife had chemo every 3 weeks, and she would have 1 week right after chemo where she couldn't get out of bed. She could barely lift her head. And then the second week she would get to feeling better, could get up a little bit. And the third week she could get out, go to church and go to kids' ball games and those kind of things. And then it was time for the chemo again. So we kind of missed about a year really of life there as a family because of that. But we got through that and everything was fine. And for the next 8 years or so, she would go for her checkups and everything was good. Life was really good. And then we moved to Texas. And I'm one of those people who love Texas. I know you haven't always lived in Texas. I don't know how you feel about it, but I love Texas. I'm one of those people who say, I wasn't born here, but I got here as quick as I could. So we fell in love with Texas. We had the most beautiful, loving church family. We didn't know anybody in that church. They asked us to come and work with them, and we did. And it was an exciting time, a growing time. About a month after we moved to Texas, my wife said, I feel a pain in my back. And she thought she had lifted some boxes when we were moving and that were too heavy. She went to the doctor, and the doctor did some tests and found out her cancer had returned. It was the breast cancer, but it had returned to her bones. And the doctor said, your bones are so brittle. I don't know how you're walking around. So they did radiation, got through that. She stayed on a pill for treatment. And again, everything was fine. We thought it was good. And so for about the next 11 years, we had great years. Everything was fine. And then they were about to release her from her annual checkups. In her last checkup, the doctor said, we're going to release you the next time if everything is okay. And when she went back, her tumor markers were raised, and anybody who's watching this who knows anything about cancer understands the idea of tumor markers. That's a crucial number. And it had gone up, and the doctor said, could be a false. Let's come back in a month and read it again. And he did, and said it was, they had gone up again this time. And so they did more tests and found out the cancer had returned, and it spread to more of her bones and was beginning to move into some of her other organs. And the doctor said, you probably have about 2 years left to live. And she lived about 18 months is how long she lived. And so that was June 20th, 2019 when she passed away. We buried her on the 22nd. So it's been a little more than 5 years now. Immediately after she passed away, it didn't take me long to realize that my life had changed forever and it would never be the same again. And, tried to think about what I need to do. I was blessed with wonderful shepherds who said, take some time off, go visit your family, just get away for a while. We'll take care of everything. And other staff members could take care of everything. And so we did that. The elder said, we have one request. Don't make any big decisions while you're gone about your future. And so I knew pretty quick that I could not minister to a church the way that I felt like the church needed to be ministered to without my wife. She was a very crucial part of my ministry, just like Holly is in yours. So, I talked to the elders, said, I can't do this. It's not fair to the church. A good-sized church, it's not fair to this church to not have a minister's wife. They need a minister's wife. And they said, we think you can. And I think they were being gracious and kind, but we agreed that I would not. They said, would you stay on a year? I said, okay, I'll stay on a year. And then, of course, COVID hit, and they said, would you stay on a little longer? And I said, I'll stay on a little longer, but I can't keep doing this. And so after a year or so, about a year and a half, I stepped away from, what we call local work and started traveling. And now my ministry is, I travel all the time. A lot of people don't know. I live in hotels, literally. I don't own an apartment or a house. And even when I'm in Dallas, a few days a month, I'm in a hotel. And I meet with preachers. I encourage preachers, and I do grief seminars, at least one a month. And so it's a good place for me to be. I need to stay busy in my life. If I wasn't busy, it'd be easy to sit around and have a pity party all the time. It's still difficult every single day. I miss my wife every single day. And there are many times that you feel very alone. People who have lost a spouse will understand this. People are kind and gracious, but there's nothing that can replace your spouse. We're together for 40 years, counting our dating years. We're married for about 38 and a half years. And so that's kind of where my life is now. I'm blessed to get to do a lot of exciting things and good things, all the things that my wife and I talked about that we would do when I retired or slowed down. And so I get jokingly asked by some of our friends who are preachers, how's retirement? And I kind of laugh because I'm busier than I've ever been in my life. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to encourage people. And if my journey, as difficult as it has been and is and probably will continue to be, if my journey can help other people, then that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
But that's probably a lot more information than you wanted, but that's...
No, brother, thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for sharing that with so many other people and allowing your experience to help bring comfort and peace to other people. I'm curious, you sort of touched on this earlier, but as a minister, you walked with and encouraged and preached funerals for those who had lost loved ones. I wonder what surprised you being on the other side of that grief process. I imagine that sometimes when we're on one side of things, we sort of assume we know what it's like to be in that situation. But then when we find ourselves in it personally, it's probably different than we imagined that it would be. So were there any surprises for you when you went through that yourself?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that come to my mind. One is how real it is, how raw it is to feel loss. I had walked with people who had been through loss, but I had never really felt. I mean, I've lost friends. My wife and I lost a baby boy. I've lost my parents, but there's nothing like losing, what we would say is our soulmate, our life mate, however you want to say that, and how real that is and how raw that can be sometimes. And then the second thing, which was a wonderfully pleasant surprise, and that is how many people there are who have deep concern and deep care, how caring our church family was. And I don't mean that to say I didn't think they were caring, but to really see it. I mean, I had seen, we lost a youth minister several years ago, passed away of cancer, and I saw our church family in action, and I thought they were good, but I didn't know. And then how caring other ministers have been, my close kind of inner circle of friends has been such a tremendous blessing. And that's been a good thing. All of that's been good to see. And what that does is it helps me know that I don't think they're doing that just for me. I think that's who they are. I think that's who the church is. And I think that's who my friends are. And I think they would do that for one another or for anybody. And it's a very encouraging thing that I've learned. I think I knew that it was good, but I don't know that I knew how encouraging it was.
Yeah. It reminds me of what Paul says in Philippians when he's writing to the church of Philippi who sent him a gift, and he thanks them for renewing their concern for him. And he says, you were always concerned for me. You always loved me, but this gave you an opportunity to show me how much you love me. And so sometimes it's not the gift itself, but it's just that opportunity to tell somebody I love you and I'm there for you. And so sometimes it takes a horrible situation before we have that opportunity to express our concern and our love and our compassion.
Yeah, I would, and that's exactly right. And another thing is, I've learned since I started doing some of these grief seminars and encouraging other churches that there are many church families that want to help more and they want to do more. They don't always know what to do, but they're willing, when they find out, they're willing to do that. I was just part of a program in Alabama, a church that they do something annually called Christ Over Cancer. And they interviewed me and a man who had gone through cancer. And they do that every year and invite the community in. A lot of people were there. The church building was full that day. And so there's a lot of churches that want to do more. And I think they don't always know how. And if through my ministry, I can help them learn how they can better help, I'm glad to do that too.
That's awesome. We try to keep, as much as we can to the text and to scripture. And so I'm curious if there are any biblical passages that come to your mind that really have shaped your thinking on grief and sorrow and loss and death.
Yes. In our seminars and in the book that I wrote called Beyond the Valley of Death, one of the things we talk about is how that there are people who have the idea, and I'm not sure where it came from, but that somehow that it's wrong to grieve, that grief could be sinful in some way. And so we talk about that a lot in the seminars. And there are three primary passages that we discuss when we're talking about that grief is not sinful. Number one is, of course, the passage in John 11 when Jesus went to the tomb of Lazarus. And, I know that when John wrote the book, the gospel, that he didn't divide it in chapters and verses. But I believe that just as God was involved in the process of the writing, that somehow he was involved in the process of bringing together the scriptures. And I don't think it's coincidental that John 11:35 is the shortest verse in the Bible. I don't know how all of that came about, but I think that serves a purpose. And so the shortest verse in the Bible said Jesus wept. And if grief is wrong, then that means Jesus sinned. And we sometimes overlook the next verse, John 11:36, that says the Jews said, look at how he loves him. Look at how he loved him. And so rather than suggesting that grief is sinful, Jesus showed us that grief is not only not sinful, but it shows how much you love somebody. That's why we grieve. The reason we grieve is not because for any reason primarily other than the fact that we love somebody. And when we lose people that we love, we're going to grieve. And so that's the first passage. The second passage is when Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, and he said, I do not want you to grieve like others who have no hope. So you've probably preached this at some point in your life. Most of us have. Paul didn't put a period after I don't want you to grieve. He is very clear by virtue of the fact the Holy Spirit helped him write it. The Holy Spirit is very clear that grief itself is not wrong. Not only do we grieve because we love somebody, but we grieve with hope. If our faith is in Jesus, if our trust is in Him, then we have hope. And the greatest blessing in my life is, from a spiritual standpoint, when I'm in town, I always go out to the cemetery, and I just spend some time out there and talk to my wife, and I talk to the Lord. And the greatest blessing is knowing that there's a body in that ground there, but that's all that's there, and that she is with the Lord. I'm convinced, and that's what brings hope into my life. And I remind my children all the time, they have their own kind of grief. We have hope that we'll get to see her again. So Paul, so grief is not sinful as long as we grieve with hope. And then the third passage is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in about verse 3. Paul says that our God is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our afflictions. When I'm doing the seminar and I talk about this passage, I talk about that word all. God is the God of all comfort, number one. Number two, He comforts us in all of our afflictions. That word all, there's a Greek word, I think it's pas. It's a 3-letter English translation. And that Greek word means all. That God is if there's any comfort in our life, whether people realize it or not, if there's any comfort in our life, it is ultimately because of God. And secondly, whatever affliction anybody has, God will bring comfort into their life. And then the key part of that passage is the next verse, where he says that He brings us this comfort so that we can comfort others with the same comfort that we've received from God. And so the way I look at that is that I have been comforted by God through His Spirit, through His people, through His Word, through life itself, through opportunities. All of that I view as comfort from God. And then I am commanded. This is a command, I believe, from the Holy Spirit, that I'm to take that comfort and bring comfort to other people. And so the fact that God is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, teaches me that grief is not sinful, and that it would be sinful if I didn't take the comfort that I've received and try to bring comfort to others. My friend Dean Miller, who does, by the way, I know sometimes you put like resources on, you'll put some resources down, and I want to encourage you to put down Widowhood Workshop. Dean Miller does Widowhood Workshop. He is the kind of the guru, if you will, for helping people who are grieving. And they have a Facebook page. You can join privately a Facebook group. He does workshops, seminars. He's written 3 books about grief. And he says his kind of theme statement in all of his work is, don't waste your pain. Now, I don't know if he originated that or if he found it somewhere, but don't waste your pain. And that's what 2 Corinthians 1, 3-5 is telling us. Don't waste your pain. You have pain in your life, but don't use it. Don't let it just be there for no purpose. Take that pain that you have and try to bring comfort to others. So for all of those 3 verses right there tell me that grief is not sinful, that we have hope, and that we are to use our grief and our suffering and our affliction. And that word affliction can include loss of loved one. It could include a physical affliction that people have. It could include, somebody going through cancer or heart disease or divorce or loss or separation or broken relationships or, just go down the list, whatever affliction is in your life, spiritual issues that you've struggled with, take whatever comfort you've received through those afflictions and help other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad that you said that, brother, because I preach this almost every funeral I do. I remind people, just like you did, that when we say it's selfish to grieve, and that's what I hear people say. I hear people say, well, I know it's selfish, but I wish they were still here with me. And I want to tell them all the time, it's not selfish. Selfishness is wrong. This is love. Love wants to be together, and of course you're upset. Of course you're angry. Of course you're grieving. Of course you're filled with sorrow because you love this person, and it's not selfish to want to be with the people that you love. And one of the verses, the passages that comes to my mind, I think about the whole chapter of 1 Corinthians 15 about the coming resurrection and what Jesus is going to do. But there Paul says that death is the last enemy to be destroyed. And I'd like to remind people, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Jeff, that I love to remind people that death is an enemy, not just like the final moment of someone's life. I mean, obviously, when somebody has been suffering for a long time, that final moment sometimes comes as a relief, but that whole process of death and dying is an enemy in God's good world. It's an invader in God's good world. And I think that so often we turn our anger towards God. We think, well, God took them away from me, or God, wanted another flower in his garden. We use all kinds of little metaphors, and we make it as if this is God's plan for people to get sick and die and go through all of these things, when really the Bible presents death as a personification of this evil that we should be angry with. It is an enemy of God, and God is in the process of and will ultimately destroy death. And so I want to encourage people, if they're going to be angry, to turn their anger not towards God. He is the comforter. It's death itself that is the enemy, and the enemy that God joins us in our righteous indignation against death. God is more upset about death even than we are. And so I think that reminding people it's okay to be grieved, to be angry, to be sad, to be sorrowful towards death, because this was not the plan of God in the beginning.
Exactly right. And you go all the way back to the beginning. Death came into our world because of Satan and because of sin. And the Bible says that sin brings forth death. So death was not something that God wanted for his people. It's not something that God used to punish his people. Death is here because of sin and because of Satan, and Jesus has already ultimately taken care of the problem of death. We still have to go through the process, just like we go through the process of life. Death is a part of life, in that it's something that we have to put up with in the world. And so God, like you said, God hates death as much as we do. And what God wants is a new life for his people. That's what I think that's what the picture of baptism is all about. It's dying to sin and bringing us a new life. And what we do, we go into the grave someday when our body is separated from our spirit, but we come out on the other side with new life. And I tell people all the time that, our prayer was that God would take away my wife's cancer. Well, guess what? He did. Now, it wasn't exactly the way that I wanted him to take it away. I wanted him to take it away and let her live, but he took away her cancer. And I hate the word cancer. I hate to hear it. Every time I hear it, it makes me angry. But God, she is in a place where she will never have another cancer, never another pill, never another chemo treatment or radiation, never another ache or pain. And that's what God did for her. And that's what he's going to do for all of us, whatever your affliction is. And so don't be angry. Don't be angry at God. I'm not sure that it's humanly possible for us not to question God and not even to be angry for a minute. But if that anger if it turns into something that does cause us to sin and cause us to separate ourselves from God, that's when it becomes a problem. I think there's a season of grief that we go through where we are angry, and we may be angry with God because we don't understand all of the things that you and I have just talked about, or either we've forgotten them for a minute. But if we can get to a place to where we use that, that anger in the correct way to help other people, then we're okay. Some people turn against God. They're angry at God, and then they turn against God, and that's where the problem comes in. And they attribute all bad things to God, which I think God is not responsible for any bad thing in the world. People go through depression, and that they go through loneliness, and they go through different seasons of grief we talk about in our book. And all of that's fine to go through that, but there's got to be at some point, some time, where we begin to work our way to a new kind of life. We'll never forget. We'll never quit being sorrowful. But if we want to be a part of that, that rejoicing, when we too will do away with all of the bad things and only see good, then we've got to figure out how to get back to that point.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I often tell people that hope, biblical hope, seems to be the ability to hold both sorrow in one hand and joy in the other. Like, we are biblical hope. You can't really have hope unless you acknowledge the horrible situation that exists. And we don't hope for what we already see. We don't hope for what we already know. We hope for what is to come. And so we acknowledge in the present the pain of whatever it is that we're going through. But then on the other hand, we also acknowledge the goodness of God and the promises of God. And so hope is this intersection of both the reality of the sorrow and the pain, and also the joy of what Jesus has brought about and what Jesus will bring about in the resurrection. And so we hold those seemingly paradoxical opposite ideas together. And I think that's what makes Christian funerals so wonderful, is that we can sing and rejoice even while we have tears streaming down our face. It's exactly what you pointed out earlier, that we do grieve. We grieve hard. We grieve real. We acknowledge the pain. We acknowledge the reality of death and how this is an invader in God's good world. But then we also acknowledge that Jesus has overcome death, and Jesus has brought us life in spite of death and even through death.
Yeah, and Wes, if it wasn't for those bad things that we hold in our hand, there would be no reason to have hope. We wouldn't need hope.
That's right.
That's what hope is. It is the promise of something better than what we're dealing with now. That's part of the definition of hope. And so we have to go through that, like we said earlier. We have to go through these things to be able to have a greater appreciation for, a greater understanding of what is.
Yeah. Jeff, you may have already touched on a lot of these, and we obviously can't go into in depth of all the things that you would talk about in your seminar or in your book, but what are some of the things that you wish everyone understood about grief?
So, Wes, I have a list of probably 8 or 10. I won't go through all of them. The first one is that grief is not sinful. So we already talked about that. I wish everybody understood. Even people who haven't gone through a deep kind of grief, I wish everybody understood that grief was not sinful. Number 2, no two griefs are the same. And by that, I mean no two people grieve in the same way, and no two personal grief experiences are exactly the same. And the reason that's important is because sometimes people will try to tell somebody who is grieving in their mind what they're doing is helpful, but they'll try to tell them where they should be in their grief journey or how they should be grieving. And my thought about this is that nobody has a right to tell anybody else how to grieve. I've been through grief. I've been through different types of grief in my life, and I'm still in this journey with the deepest kind of grief. I believe the deepest kind of grief in life, but I don't think I have the right to tell anybody how to grieve. And that may be something I've learned that I didn't know before. I may have tried to tell people, well, here's what you need to do, or here's where you need to be. And nobody can do that, and nobody should. And so for somebody who may be grieving right now, who's watching this later on, or who's dealing with grief, don't let somebody make you feel bad because they try to tell you where you should be or how you should be grieving. So no two grief are the same. Number 3, grief is not just about death. There are many people who are grieving who have not lost a mate, a spouse, who have not lost a child. Maybe some who have not lost a parent, or maybe really have never lost anybody close to them, but they grieve. They grieve. We talk about divorce, separation, broken relationships, separations because of faith between parents and children, personal sin, anything that you want to talk about that brings sorrow should be considered grief. So I don't want to make this all about that grief. You can only grieve if you've lost a mate or if you've lost somebody close to you. And then we talk about the seasons of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book called The 5 Stages of Grief. I kind of stole her ideas, but I call them the seasons of grief, and we talk about why we call them seasons instead of stages in the seminar. We talk about the fact that a grieving people's life will be filled with questions. Why, how, what could I have done different? When will this get better? A lot of questions that grieving people deal with. Then we talk about the fact that there are people who will try to be kind and say things that they think will be helpful, but they will not always be. And so those of us who are the ones who are hearing that need to be gracious to people who may not understand. You mentioned about God needing another flower in his garden. I can't tell you how many times I heard people say, well, God needed another angel, and I'm thinking, I want to slap you in the face right now. I think God's got plenty of angels, myriads and myriads of them. He didn't need another angel. So people will try to say things, aren't you glad they're not hurting anymore? Well, yeah, but I wish they were not hurting here, People would say, take one day at a time. And that sounds good on the surface, but when you've just been hit as hard as you've ever been hit in your life, you're thinking 1 day at a time, how about 1 step at a time, 1 second at a time. So I wish people understood that those of us who are grieving a lot, we need to understand that people will try to be helpful and be gracious to people who may not understand. And so sometimes you just smile and say thank you. Then we talk about kind of the last thing is, what can we do to move ahead? What can we do to move ahead? So that's kind of a brief synopsis. There's a lot more to all of that than we probably have time to talk about now, but I do want to mention the book. It's called Beyond the Valley of Grief, or Beyond the Valley of Death. It's primarily written from my standpoint about losing a spouse, but I think it would help anybody who's lost a child. And Wes, we don't sell those books; we give them away. And so if there's anybody who's watching today or later on, and they would like a copy of it, if they would they could message me or you and give us a name and a mailing address. We will have them sent to them. There's no charge at all for them. We've given away probably 3,000 or 4,000 of those books, and we want to give as many away as we can. We have some folks who help us pay for them, so that a guy said, we don't want anybody to have to pay for this. And of course, my initial reaction as the author was, you don't think it's worth anything. But he said, no, we want people to have them. And so we make them available, and we make them available to churches in bulk. I've sent 50 or 100 or 25 for churches to give away. And there are churches that use them in their ministry. They'll give them out at the funeral home, put their, information in there. So in the book, there's more information about some of the things we've talked about.
Well, thank you for doing that ministry for so many people, not only in person in your seminars, but your book as well, especially giving it away the way that you do. Jeff, you mentioned, and I'm so glad that you did, about everybody has a different journey of grief and that everybody's journey looks different. And it makes me think about parents sometimes, or anyone, two people who lose the same person in their life, two parents who lose a child, or two children who lose a parent, or a parent who loses a child, and then the sibling who lost the same person in their life. Even though it's the same person, the journey that each of them go on is different. And so often I see, and I'm sure that you see this as well, it sort of can drive a wedge between people when there's judgment towards the other person about how they're grieving and the journey they're on.
Yeah, and probably that's more magnified when there are two parents who lose a child, and when one of them maybe doesn't go through the seasons of grief as quickly as the other one does. They take longer. And the other one can become frustrated because they think you should be where I am. And I wish there was a way we could help people to know and encourage people to realize that we are different. Surely people who are married, if we could get away from the grief for a moment and think about our marriage apart from the grief, that we're not always the same. We have different tastes and different likes, and we have different ways that we deal with relationships and problems, and even in parenting. People don't always agree about how to parent a child. So if we could get our minds away from the grief for just a moment, to realize that it's okay for another person, for my spouse, not to deal with this exactly the way that I am. And I've counseled with some people who it has become a major issue in their marriage, major problems with their marriage. And of course, if there are other children, that affects the whole family. It affects other children. And if the children are grown, it affects those sibling relationships as well. And I've seen, multiple children who lose a parent, and they don't all deal with it in the same way. And so I don't know how we can fix that, other than to just encourage people to know that there's not a correct way that is foolproof, that everybody has to do it this way. I say in the seminars, there's not a book called 10 Easy Steps to Dealing with Grief. And I haven't looked it up. There actually may be a book called 10 Easy Steps, but the author's foolish, because that's not, it can't be correct. There's no way to say, this is the only way to do this. And so if we could get people, who are married, siblings, to realize that everybody's different, everybody's going to deal with it differently, and just extend a little more grace to one another, I think would help.
You've sort of touched on this already, but what are some of the things that we can do to, as you've already said, comfort one another with the comfort we've received from God? What can we do as individual Christians and collectively as churches? when someone that we know and love is going through a season of grief, what can we do to best minister to them and comfort them?
I think there are two kind of aspects to this. One is kind of a church family aspect. What can the church do? And I want to touch on that briefly. I think the church needs to recognize as a family when somebody is grieving. We often have special prayers for people who are dealing with cancer or are going through some problem in their life, or maybe relationship issues, and we'll pray specifically for that individual. I think we would do well to remember when a family loses a loved one. I don't think we need to, make them stand up or give them or call a special attention to them that in some way would be embarrassing or anything like that. But I think we should let them know that we're here, we're praying for you, we're going to pray for you, shepherds will pray for you, we're going to put our arms around you. I've seen the church, when somebody loses a loved one, people take food to their house. They go and help them clean their house. When I lost my wife, I was going to leave town for a few weeks, about 3 weeks, and one of the guys from church, who not an elder, not a deacon, not anybody who stood out, who was a leader kind of guy, he walked over to me and he said, "I understand you're going to be gone." He said, I want you to, don't worry about your yard. I'm going to cut your grass. I'm going to take care of your yard. Well, I hadn't thought about my grass. So, I hadn't thought about the next 3 weeks. This was in June, and so the heat of the summer and the grass needed to be taken care of. And I probably would have walked away and never given a thought to it. But here's somebody who came to me and said that. And so one of the things we say in the seminars is, when you want to help somebody, don't just say, "If there's anything I can do for you, call me," because that person is not in a place in their mind where they can think of what needs to be done. So think of things you can specifically do, whether you're talking about a church or an individual. Think of things you can specifically do and say, "I'd like to come do your laundry for you," or "I'd like to take care of your car." If it's a woman who's lost her husband, change the oil in your car. "I'd like to, take care of your yard for you." Do something. Think of something specific that you can do. And there are churches that have ministries where they have men or women who do those kind of things as a ministry. So I think that's one thing. Individually, we should continue to let people know we're praying for them. Again, think of the things we can do for them that might be helpful to them in their life. And then a big thing is don't forget about them quickly. When somebody loses a mate or a child, they'll be surrounded by family for a few days. My children came. They were great. Neither of them lived in town. They were wonderful. They did a lot of things that I would not have thought about. They did some things that needed to be done that I didn't know needed to be done. And then they went away because they had their own lives to live, which is the way they're supposed to do. That's when the church really needs to step up big. And those of us who are Christians need to step up big and say, "I'm not going to forget about you." I have a group of, there's about 5 preachers, 4, 5 including me, who are kind of, I call them my inner circle of friends. And all of these guys, they came to the funeral. 3 of them brought their wives, and they drove probably 10 or 11 hours to come to my wife's funeral. And Wes, there has not been 1 week since my wife passed away that I've not received a call from at least one of those guys. Not a week goes by. And I don't know if they sat down and figured out a schedule, or I don't know how they did that, but every week for more than 5 years, I've heard from them. And I don't think they can know how valuable that is to me. So that's part of not forgetting about somebody, continually reaching out to them, do something nice on anniversary dates, like when it was my wife's birthday, I went out to the cemetery and somebody had brought flowers and put a happy birthday balloon out there. I don't know who did that, just somebody who was a friend. So there are small things that we can do. They don't cost a lot, but just, we talk a lot about, we preacher types talk a lot about being Christ to the world, We can be Christ to one another, and that's what we need. So just don't forget, continue to encourage people, continue to help them. And churches can, I think the seminars, I think every church ought to have annually some kind of event. It could be a seminar, it could be a reception, to help people remember that the church is still there. I do at least one seminar a month. I don't think I have to, if somebody wants to do a seminar, I don't have to do it, but have somebody to come and help let people know we're interested in you. We're doing this for you. I think that's huge.
Well, Jeff, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for being such an encourager. You are truly a Barnabas, a son of encouragement. You encourage me. I tell people this story all the time, but it was my first time to speak at this conference you and I go to every year, Red River Family Encampment, and my first time to speak there. And I got a text from somebody that I didn't have their number saved yet in my phone. And I got a text that was just incredibly encouraging. And I'm sorry I won't be able to be there. I'm sure you're going to do a great job. And this encouraging text. And I thought, I don't know who this is from, but I know that it's Jeff Jenkins, because I don't know anybody else that is that encouraging. And brother, you just, from the moment I met you, you have lifted my hands up. You've been an encouragement to me, even through everything that you've been through. Thank you for the way that you encourage preachers, the way that you encourage the church, the way you encourage the grieving. Thank you for your work in the kingdom, brother. I can't even tell you thank you enough.
Well, I appreciate that, Wes. And some people are a lot easier to encourage than others are, and you're one of those people. And I love you and consider you to be valuable to the Lord and to his kingdom. And I hope you know that if I could ever do anything for you, I would. And I do want to say to people who are watching this, if I can be of help to you, if you have questions, I'll give out my phone number. I'm here, and I mean, I'm not here. I'm never anywhere for very long, but I have a phone and I can talk. And if you need somebody, I'll be glad to try to be helpful.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much for listening to the Radically Christian Bible Study Podcast. If you have just a moment, we would love for you to rate and review this podcast on iTunes or wherever you're listening. It really does help more people discover this content. I also want to thank the guests who join me each week, Beth Tabor, who volunteers her time to transcribe the podcast, and our whole McDermott Road Church family who make it possible for us to provide this Bible study for you. Now, let's all go out and love like Jesus.